I'm David O'Reilly. I'm the religion reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we're leading up to the extraordinary visit by Pope Francis to the city of Philadelphia, an appearance that's expected to draw more than 1 million people into Center City for a Mass and several other very important and exciting public appearances. In preparation for that, we're today interviewing Austen Ivereigh, a British journalist who has written what is considered the definitive biography of Pope Francis, called The Great Reformer. It's been very well received, and it's also even been voted the Philadelphia Inquirer's best book of the year. It came out last year. It's now in paperback. And we're going to talk a bit about this extraordinary man who has taken the world by storm, I think it's fair to say, and has very much excited the people of Philadelphia. And we're going to talk about who he is, how he was shaped as a man, and what his vision is for the church. So we're going to start right here with the title of the biography itself. You call him the Great Reformer. And I'm wondering why you chose that for your title, and what is it Francis is trying to reform? Is it the papacy, the Catholic Church, the whole world?
David, the name came to me really when I was beginning to do the research, and that was towards the end of the year in which he was elected. So I'm talking about the end of 2013. And it was clear, as I was beginning my research, that he has a vision for the papacy, a vision for the church, and that he is a reformer, that he was putting in place changes that I think will have a lasting impact on the church. Now, since I began researching the book, since the book's come out, I think that's been confirmed. I think he really is emerging as a person with a very powerful vision. Now, what is that reform? What kind of a reformer is he? Is, of course, the $6 million question. Because a lot of people interpret what he's doing. He's clearly a change agent, but what kind of change is it? Now, what I show through telling his life story here is that in fact he has a vision for the church which is really rooted in a kind of almost a medieval idea that the church needs to propose the gospel in a straightforward, clear way which does not involve wealth, power, and so on. In other words, it's about purging the church in order that it can present the gospel more clearly. Now, he's a reformer because he has the vision. He's also a reformer because he has the capacity to carry it out. He is a man of governance. He's a natural leader, and that story, of course, I tell in the book. He was, as a young Jesuit, elected the head of the Society of Jesus in Argentina in a very turbulent time, went on to be a bishop, cardinal archbishop, emerged as a leader of the Latin American church, and then, of course, became pope. And of course, in each occasion, at each juncture, he emerges as the man of the moment who has the vision and the capacity to carry out the reforms. So I think if there's one thing that you can say unites his whole life, it is that he is a great reformer.
Now, you use the word radical in the subtext and the subtitle, and the word radical scares some people. How do you define radical?
I mean, it was a provocative word, because one of the things I wanted to show is that he's a radical, but he's not Che Guevara, right? He's a radical in a Catholic sense. He's a radical in the sense of his hero, St. Francis of Assisi, whose name, of course, he took. Now, what's unusual is that here we have a pope who, if you like, is St. Francis of Assisi, who's handed the keys of St. Peter. That's what's unusual about this man. Normally, prophetic figures do not get given the power, but he has been. What makes him a radical is, radical comes from the word root, so it's all about getting back to the root of what the church is about doing. It's the essence of its mission. But he's radical in another way, and I think this comes through in the book very clearly, is that he roots himself, his papacy, his vision of the church, in the ordinary believing people, and defends them against the elites. So in many ways, what he's doing at the moment is taking the church, if you like, wresting the church from the control of the princes and handing it back to the people, the princes both of the church and in a way of the world, because he is also a very powerful defender of the gospel and the church and the interests of the poor and ordinary people against, as it were, the powers of this world, whether it be big business or the state. So he's a radical in that sense, and not just radical in one other sense in which I think we use the word, which is he's tough, he's courageous. He's not messing about. He hasn't got long. He knows it's going to be a short pontificate, so he's driving things through.
In your biography, you talk about him as a young priest with a vision of the church as a church on the periphery. What is the periphery? Who occupies the periphery?
A really key idea for this pope is that true reform, true change, conversion, comes when the center, the power, opens itself up to the margins, to the periphery. Now that idea is very clear from his theology that he read in the 1960s, but also from actually the Jesuit experience in South America in the 18th century. That the Jesuits, when they arrived in South America, didn't go to the big cities where they went away from the cities into the jungle, and there they built these huge civilizations with the Guarani Indians. So the idea is always to go out to the periphery, to go out to where there is need and suffering. As Pope, what he's doing in a way is connecting the papacy to the periphery. So a lot of his reforms of governance, reforms of the Vatican, the Synod of Bishops, for example, which is looking at very huge questions to do with the pastoral care of families. What he's doing is he's allowing the local church to shape, if you like, the central church. He's allowing the voice of ordinary people and the experience of priests and bishops to be brought to bear on the doctrinal. And just look, in one very simple way, he starts from the margins geographically. I mean, you notice that since he became Pope, he hasn't gone to the big countries. I mean, that's what's fascinating about this visit to the US. He's coming here to a very powerful country. He's ignored the big countries so far. He's gone to small countries, and he was in South America in July. He started with the 3 poorest countries in South America. So he actually believes in starting on the edge and moving to the center. Now, of course, what a lot of people are missing about this trip here to the United States is that actually it's a Cuba-US visit. He's starting in Cuba, spending almost as long in Cuba as he is in the United States. And I think that's something that is important to him, that he's arriving in the US from Cuba. He wanted, of course, as everybody knows, to come through the Mexico border, but that wasn't possible for all kinds of reasons. Instead, he's coming from Cuba. Comes from the periphery to the center, bringing the voice, the experience of the excluded and the marginalized, and invites the powerful to hear, to listen, and to be converted by that experience.
There's a perception of him as a liberal or a progressive. Those words are charged for some people. Are they fair? Are they useful labels?
No, because actually liberal is a liberal Catholic is somebody who in many ways seeks to change church doctrine to make it more acceptable in a way to modern culture and modern civilization. There's an element of dilution there. Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis, is not and has never been about diluting church doctrine to make it more acceptable to society and to modernity. But what he is doing, and that's why people, I think, confuse this with progressive, is he's putting the merciful love of God and the experience of unconditional acceptance and forgiveness, he's putting that front and center of the church's message and his own actions as Pope. So what people see in this man, in this Pope, in this papacy, is a little of that, that unconditional love. And of course that makes them feel warm, that makes them feel accepted. This is not a judgmental man. But I think that actually the people that then conclude that he's a liberal are mistaking the fact that there is a powerful judgment involved. In many ways, this is a very judgmental Pope. I mean, he has very harsh words for the church. He has very harsh words for, for big business, for political power and so on. And he's not afraid to judge this world, if you like, and to judge the church. So it's a paradox, but I think it's a very gospel paradox. I mean, it's a bit, Jesus was not warm and fuzzy, but Jesus was pure love, and yet Jesus also challenged. And I think that you're getting the same combination in Francis.
Very early in his pontificate, on his first papal journey, he uttered 5 words that seem to have embossed his reputation, and that is the famous "Who am I to judge" line. I think much misunderstood. Would you like to tell us a bit about it and the context?
Yeah, I mean, the context was a very dramatic one. This was his first apostolic voyage as Pope. He went to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil for World Youth Day. It was a date that was already in the calendar of the previous Pope Benedict. And on the way out, the papal journalists were expecting, the Vatican journalists who always accompany the Pope, were expecting him to do the usual thing that popes have done, which is answer a few pre-prepared questions. He didn't do that. But what he did was, on the way back to Rome, he came out and he said to the Vatican journalists, "Fine, ask me anything you like." Stood there for a whole hour and a half, I mean, extraordinary, and literally answered any question. Nothing was pre-prepared. Now, one of the questions was about a homosexual priest, or a priest that was said to be homosexual and had been involved in a gay scandal many, many years before. And he was asked about this, and his reply was, "If this man is gay and he's a person of goodwill, who am I to judge him?" Now, there were 2 key things about that. One, he used the word gay, which popes generally haven't done. Right. And secondly, of course, he used this expression, "Who am I to judge?" Actually, what he was articulating was straightforward Catholic doctrine. In fact, he went on to talk about how the Church has always opposed the discrimination against and exclusion of gay people. But the language, the directness, and the way he phrased it felt revolutionary, and so it became in many ways the iconic phrase of this papacy. But actually, he wasn't moving church doctrine, he wasn't changing church doctrine at all. What he was doing, and this is very typical of Francis, was that he was first expressing, or putting the emphasis on, the part of church teaching that doesn't get heard, for all kinds of reasons that we can analyse. But traditionally it doesn't get heard. That's the bit he puts front and centre, and I think that's what's so disarming about him. That's why I think this Pope is able to speak to contemporary Western society in a way that previous popes haven't been able to, because of it's something to do with the language and the directness that he uses, the fact that there really isn't a distance that he puts in his language and his way of being between us and him. So he's bridging, he's overcoming that gap, if you like. And I think most people say, well, I may or may not agree with the Church, but I know that this guy is sincere and I feel that he loves me, you know, that there's an integrity in that message. And I think that's why he's such a compelling communicator. Because one of the things about this Pope, one of the reforms, one of the revolutions that he's carrying out is in papal communication. I mean, we now have a Pope who, and the great irony is, of course, as Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he never gave any interviews. He's now given, in 2 years as Pope, more interviews than all popes in history combined ever. And a lot of these interviews are arranged without the Holy See press office even knowing about it. And they're sometimes, you know, long interviews in which he says all kinds of things spontaneously. And this is a whole new form of papal communication. So there's, I think we now know more about what this Pope thinks and feels, and some people, of course, would like him to say a lot less than he does, than really any previous Pope, and I think that's helped to overcome that distance.
I'm surprised at the number of people who seem to think he somehow had rewritten the Church's position on homosexual behavior, but he did not.
Well, I mean, I just saw the other day somebody compiled what they said was a contradictory list of Francis's statements on homosexuality. And they're mixing up statements that are condemnatory of what he calls the ideological colonization, so, you know, gender ideology. He's a fierce critic of gay marriage. He's a fierce critic of the state's attempts to, you know, put homosexual relationships on the same level as a man and woman and so on. And yet his language about gay people and his pastoral attention to gay people is loving and merciful. Well, is this a contradiction? I don't think it is. I mean, this is the contradiction, or the, if you like, the tension of Christianity, isn't it? I mean, you know, Jesus embraced and loved people, at the same time challenged them to change, you know. He's not adjusting church teaching to suit people. I mean, as Archbishop Chaput, I think, said recently, you know, very well, you know, just because we disagree with you doesn't mean we don't love you. And I think Francis really embodies the love and the acceptance in how he is, how he speaks, and what he does, and that's really getting through to people. And then it leaves some people confused, saying, well, hang on, if he's so loving and accepting, how can he live with this church doctrine, which appears to be different? But of course the Church would say, well, actually the doctrine is an invitation to convert like anybody else.
A few weeks after he leaves Philadelphia, he's going to host the Synod on the Family in Rome. A lot of people have expectations for it. Some people wonder, can the Church change its position on divorce and remarried? Some people even wonder on same-sex marriage. Some of those other things, I don't know whether the question of married clergy would come up in this. But do you have a sense of whether he has an agenda for that? Does he have ideas of what the outcomes he'd like to see?
What he wants to see from the Synod is the Church coming up with creative and imaginative solutions to the problem, the very real problem of people who have become alienated from parishes and the Church's sacraments through divorce and remarriage. If you, in the Catholic Church, divorce and you enter into another relationship without having your first marriage annulled, then you are living in sin, therefore you can't receive the sacraments. Now, because there is so much divorce, and because Catholics divorce, you know, almost as much as the rest of the population, what it means in effect is that, you know, more and more people have become alienated. Now, Francis knows that there are many people who are part of parishes who have often gone through great conversion and so on and want to be part of parish life, but they're excluded from the sacraments. He wants the bishops to come up with creative ways in which they can be readmitted if possible, to the sacraments. Now, that's where the rubber hits the road, because of course the Church can't do anything that at the same time undermines its witness to indissolubility. You know, the Church says marriage is forever. So this is the tension, but this is a very Francis type tension. He believes that's where the Church should be sitting, you know, in that tension. And he's convinced with the Synod that if the Church is able to endure that tension, as it were, it creates the space for the Holy Spirit to act. This is how he sees, by the way, his own role. He sees himself as Pope as creating the space for the Holy Spirit to take things on in a way that human beings often can't see. So while this is very typical, you know, everybody's incredibly nervous, saying, how on earth can this be happening? There are some people saying, oh, you know, church teaching is going to be changed and so on. He stays very calm through all of this, and he says, no, we're going to see this through. And he's confident that if there is agreement and convergence in October, that will be a sign of the Holy Spirit. This is how the early church councils worked, and he's resurrecting them.
There's a perception of him as a smiling, affable guy, a hugger. I mean, somebody who'd give you a hug if you got close enough to him. So there's a perception of him as a pastor. But, you know, the Church has also been occupied over the years, led by prophets. Does he fit into either of those categories?
Yeah, I think he's both prophet and pastor, and I think that's an unusual combination. I've met him on a couple of occasions, very briefly. But let me just tell you about the second one. I gave him a copy of the book, and I went to Mass with him in the Santa Marta, where he lives in the Vatican, beautiful Mass. And afterwards, he stood outside like a parish priest, shaking people's hand as they came out. And I gave him the books, and he looked a bit startled, you know, and he gave them to his secretary. But he gave off this incredible love, a huge smile. And I had the sense of this very joyful man who was, at the same time, very, very strong, very powerful, you know, very rooted. And in fact, I started to give a little bit of a speech in Spanish, you know, which I'd sort of prepared the night before rather nervously. And he put his hand on my arm, and he just said, you know, almost to say, look, I don't need your speech, you know, you're fine, you know. And he said, adelante in Spanish, you know, go on, you're fine. And it was very, very loving, very, sort of very paternal, very fatherly, really. That's him. I mean, he's incredibly pastoral. People say, even as Pope, he spends a phenomenal amount of time just attending to people's needs. I mean, how he does it as Pope, you know, but it's important for him to give up that time for people. And for him, the person in front of him is the most important person at that moment. And I certainly saw that then. I mean, afterwards I said to my wife, you know, why don't you think he wanted to listen to me? And he says, she said, don't you get it? He was more interested in you than in your book, you know, which I think says a lot about him, you know. But I just want to add that, you know, he has got this core of steel. You know, he was elected because it was considered that here was a man who could confront the interests that were preventing the Vatican from being reformed. You know, he had the guts, the will to do it, and he's certainly demonstrating that.
Well, and when we read his rather extraordinary encyclical that's been abbreviated to be on global warming, more complex than that, the whole care of the earth, there is, I'd say, an acuity and a fierceness at the core of it. Absolutely. I mean, it just shows there's steel inside that. Absolutely. Man.
Yeah. No, I mean, the whole, I mean, I think people are only now beginning to wake up to also just how political a Pope he is, in the sense that he's willing, really, he has a very broad vision of the world. And you know, that encyclical takes in everything. I mean, it's a denunciation, really, of a model of capitalist growth in which, you know, the consumerism, the way the rich are living, is deeply affecting the way the poor live, and it's damaging the planet. And he's saying we have to change, otherwise we're headed for doomsday. Yeah. You know, and that's the other thing I think that surprises people. He looks far ahead in the future in a rather apocalyptic way. You know, this is a man also who has a very powerful sense of the devil. You know, yeah. So in many ways, you see, he's a very unmodern character. He's a very, you know, there's something, as I say in the book, almost a primitive there in his belief about good and evil. And of course, he is a Jesuit. He spent his life waking up every morning, contemplating the scriptures, imagining and experiencing the presence of Jesus Christ and the presence of another spirit that the Jesuits have always called the bad spirit. And this is how he makes decisions. He genuinely makes decisions. Is this God's will? And ultimately, you know, people say, you know, what kind of a governor is he? Well, I'll tell you, he ultimately says, if this is what God's will is, I'm going to do it, whether it makes me unpopular or not. He's not about courting popularity. He's doing what he believes is God's will. And that responsibility rests on his shoulders as Pope.
He said not too long ago, I won't be with you for much longer. He's 78. He has one lung.
Yeah.
What do you suppose he was saying?
Not quite true. He had a third of one part of his lung removed,
right.
but it's not actually his. I mean, he does have some problem breathing. He gets breathless after a while. He has sciatica. He has a bit of arthritis. I mean, look, he has the kind of complaints that elderly people have. He's not in the best of health. But on the other hand, everybody who's close to him, and when I met him, he doesn't seem to have any major health problems. But you're right, he's 78. And he has said, I think I have a 5-year pontificate, which means that when he's 82, he would step down if he hasn't, of course, died by that time. And I think he does believe that it will be a short pontificate. He's in a hurry. And I think he believes that he's putting in the short time, he's going to put in place processes as well as say things that, of course, are going to outlast him.
When we talk about Francis's vision for the church, I just wonder if he only has a 5-year pontificate or so. Are the leaders of the Catholic Church, the cardinals, prepared to choose another Francis?
Well, I mean, some of them joke that that they knew they were electing a reformer, but they had no idea really what they were letting themselves in for. Look, I think it's it's common in the Catholic Church for if you like whirlwind popes to be followed by calmer sea type popes. They always say a fat pope is followed by a thin pope in Italian. But I think that the next pope, and indeed the next few popes, I think will be very much shaped by Francis's vision. Above all, the attempt to recover mercy as, if you like, the primary message of the church, as the core to evangelization. I think, in a sense, that's going to last, And I think the other thing is he's initiated reforms in structure of the Curia, of the Vatican, reforms in governance, reforms in the way the church goes about changing, that I think it's a bit like letting the genie out of the bottle. I don't think that can be put back. And so I expect his key changes to endure. But, one thing I've learned as a Catholic, and, you and I have both followed a few conclaves, David, and transitions in the church, is you never quite know what's going to happen. And I suppose ultimately you, as Pope Francis says, the Holy Spirit's in charge of the church, and who knows?
The World Meeting and his visit here are going to be just sort of take the city of Philadelphia by storm. Do you expect to be here?
I'm going to be here. I'm actually going to be in Cuba first, and then I'm going to New York, and then I'm coming on to Philly, more or less when the Pope is here, and I shall be following it and commentating on it. I think it's going to be an extraordinary visit. It's no secret that Francis himself has been nervous about this visit. He said on the plane back from South America that he was going to spend the whole month of August studying for it, which is rather quaint. One has an image of him with sort of piles of books, Guide to Philadelphia and so on. But because of course he hasn't been here before. This will be his first ever visit as a man, as a person to the United States. I think he's come actually to learn as well as to preach. But I think he's coming to challenge in a very gentle way. What I think people will be surprised by is how quickly he connects with ordinary Americans. There will be a rapport there that he'll establish, I think, very early on. But here in Philadelphia, at that final mass, with those 1 million people, I think that's when Americans are really going to get to know Francis. And I think they're going to be challenged by him, because we all are. But I think they're going to love him.
Well, thank you, Austen, so much. We've been talking to Austen Ivereigh, biographer of Pope Francis, and he'll be writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer in the weeks ahead. I hope you can look for him and enjoy what we've done here today. Thank you.